In the middle of the 16th century, the Tsar Ivan IV, better known as the Terrible, ruled over Russia. During his reign, he engulfed the empire in an exhausting spiral of violence. Let's dive into the reign of the most famous yet broadly unknown Russian Tsar and discover how and why his empire was plunged into chaos. The year is 1552. The young Russian Tsar Ivan IV conquered the Khanate of Kazan. It was one of several Muslim successor states of the Mongol Golden Horde along the Volga River. These entities, albeit weakened and divided, were still a threat for Russia. These Khanates were feared for their raids on Russian villages. The aim was to capture villagers and sell them on slave markets. Ivan IV was the first official Tsar of Russia. This title was inspired by Roman Caesars, Byzantine tradition, and to a lesser extent, steppe Khans, the former rulers of Russia. This title helped to strengthen and ritualize the Russian autocracy. Strong with it, the highly pious Tsar called for a sort of crusade against the Muslim Mongol descendants. In 1556, the added conquest of Astrakhan roughly doubled the size of the empire. In the process, a non-Slavic, Muslim and resentful population was subdued. Russia expanded partly because of the modernization of the army. The most famous example was the Streltsy, one of the earliest standing army in Europe. This conquest also gave new economic openings via the Volga River and the Caspian Sea. On a geopolitical side, Russia also deepened its link with the rest of Europe, especially and surprisingly with England. For domestic affairs, the Tsar made several legal reforms to check the powers of both the church and the nobility. At that time, the reign of Ivan IV seemed to be at its zenith. Nonetheless, the extension of the empire would pose severe structural issues, already planting the seeds of future disasters. Like almost all empires in history, the side of Russia became a curse. A big empire meant a big army to guard an enormous border. This was essential as the remaining Khanates of Central Asia were still a threat. This dramatic increase in both territory size and army was followed by a growth in taxes. This meant harder time for a mostly poor peasantry, the majority of the Russian population. For them, the situation worsened because of bad harvest, leading to famine. This was possibly caused by a general cooling in Europe, called in history book the Little Ice Age. For the nobility, the situation also worsened. Many landowners were wealthy because of their estates, so the nobility was impoverished when crops failed. But it did not stop there. Because of the enormous borders, massive military efforts were demanded by the Tsar. In 1556, a new law made it mandatory for all landowners to perform military service. Originally a will to secure the country, this led to awful consequences in application. The same law specified that noblemen had to fund cavalry-equipped troops in proportion to their holdings. This good idea on paper would financially choke poorer landowners because funding fully equipped cavalry troops was extremely expensive. This would both ruin the nobility and bring even more taxes on the peasantry. To precisely control tax collections, the Tsar appointed tax collectors and bureaucrats at the local level. This contributed to both centralizing the state and adding even more coercion. These tax collectors were extremely zealous. They contributed to filling the state's coffers, thoroughly emptying the pockets of the population in the process. Back in 1553, Ivan IV fell gravely ill. Believing he was about to die, he gathered around him the boyars. These men were the highest member of the Russian aristocracy. To secure his lineage, the Tsar asked them to swear fidelity to his infant son. For Ivan, it was essential, because being the first Tsar, the rules of succession were still unclear. Unfortunately for him, the boyars refused to comply. They feared a long period of regency that would weaken the country, and thus supported another prince instead. For the boyars, it was political pragmatism. For the Tsar, it was an act of treason. From this moment, political distrust would grow wider and poison the relations between the Tsar and the boyars. On the military side, Ivan IV did not pursue his campaigns against the Khanates. Instead, he turned his focus on the Baltic Sea and its lucrative trade routes. The Tsar wished to conquer a foothold to benefit from them. This would lead to the Livonian War, fought where Latvia is located today. Started in 1558, the conflict would last for 25 years. Russia would fight alternatively against the Kingdom of Sweden, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the territories controlled by the Teutonic Knights. This endless, bloody and disastrous conflict would be catastrophic for Russia. The treasury was depleted and tax grew to unprecedented levels. Also, at the head of the state, the distrust of the Tsar for his nobles would soon ravage the country. Ivan's defiance of the Russian aristocracy would be exacerbated by grief. In 1560, his first wife, the Tsarina Anastasia, died. She followed 4 of the Tsar's 6 children who died in infancy. Becoming increasingly paranoid, Ivan IV would be wrongly convinced that his family was poisoned by the boyars. The final straw of this mistrust would be finally reached in 1564. Then a prominent Russian noble, Prince Andrei Kurbsky, defected to the enemy state of Lithuania. At the end of the year, Ivan IV, pretending to be on a pilgrimage with some boyars, departed from Moscow and reached the fortress. No news came from him from a whole month. Finally, the Tsar sent a letter to the remaining boyars in Moscow. In this message, he announced his abdication. Ivan argued that he was surrounded by betrayal and deception, thus unable to rule. This letter was a calculated plan. Ivan knew that the boyars divided between Moscow and his fortress could not rule the country. He accepted to return on one condition: to be given the right to prosecute supposed traitors without legal limitations. The boyars accepted the Tsar's condition, inadvertently opening the Pandora's box. Back on his throne, Ivan launched the largest political purge Russia had yet experienced, the Oprichnina. To carry out his investigations, Ivan IV divided Russia in two. One part was still ruled by the boyars in Moscow. The other part, scattered among richer territories, was under the direct control of the Oprichnina and the Tsar himself. He was now supported by new men called the oprichniki, mostly coming from outside the existing nobility. They were under the personal control of the Tsar and viscerally loyal to him because of their new powerful status. They acted like a personal political and military corps, also exercising police-like functions. On the field, their role was to rule the confiscated estates of supposedly disloyal nobles. In practice, the goal was to overthrow the old nobility and replace it with men more docile. Wearing black, the oprichniki would terrorize the population by storming villages on horseback. On their saddle, they reportedly carried a broom and the severed head of a dog. Once established, they would rule with an iron hand. Their ruthlessness on land they controlled caused many peasants to go away. This contributed to weakening the country even more in this time of war. The most infamous episode of the Oprichnina happened in 1570. On this date, the important merchant city of Novgorod was sacked. This happened because the city was suspected of plotting with Poland-Lithuania. For a week, hell befell Novgorod. The oprichniki and the Tsar himself committed extreme acts of violence against the city nobles, the clergy, and the population. Once a major trading hub, Novgorod would lose its international status after the sacking. For the deeply religious and superstitious Russian population, the Oprichnina would be perceived as a punishment from God. At the same time, a plague epidemic would amplify this feeling of looming apocalypse. However, the oprichniki would soon show their uselessness. In 1572, the Crimean Tatars rode all the way to Moscow. They nearly completely burned the city to the ground and took, allegedly, 100,000 prisoners. The oprichniki, unable to stop them, proved that they were more akin to ruthless bullies than to efficient soldiers. Within reasonable limits, because of obvious political and institutional differences, some cautious similarities could be observed between the NKVD of Stalin's USSR and the oprichniki of Ivan IV. A paranoid leader would favor people for loyalty over skills, using both zeal and the fear of their courtiers to lose their powerful yet precarious position. All of this leading to arbitrary violence and incompetence, threatening the very existence of the state. After this humiliation, the Tsar put an end, officially at least, to the oprichnina. Even so, the time of crisis for the Russian nobility would not end. Despite their military shortcomings, Ivan IV would still keep oprichniki in his entourage. The Russian Tsar purposefully used factionalism to establish his total control. It was a classic scenario of divide and conquer. Of course, this did nothing to calm the tensions within the country. Because of all of these events, living conditions in Russia were worsening. Both the landowning nobility and their peasants faced insurmountable hardships. Russia's population had grown during the previous generations. Usually a good situation, this greatly hindered the nobility for logistical reasons. Noble families now had to divide their size-limited lands between more sons. Surprisingly, despite Russia's doubling in size, lands allowed for noble families were still in short supply, and this led to a downward spiral. Because depending exclusively on harvests, nobles had less land, thus less revenue. Wealth obviously collapsed during years with crop failure. Having to deal with famine, nobles were also unable to fulfill their military duties. This led to even more taxes for the peasants. Consequently, many of them escaped to supposedly less troublesome lands. This would, perversely, increase the fiscal burden of those who stayed. New laws were passed to bond peasants to the land they were toiling on. This was a significant step for the installation of the infamous serfdom in Russia. The landowning nobility, pushed to the limit, literally plundered their own peasantry. This simply worsened the vicious circle of peasants living anyway. The peasant hemorrhage was uncontrollable. To give a staggering example, some areas around Moscow lost nearly 90% of their inhabitants. Out of desperation, a significant portion of the population chose the path of lawlessness or even servitude, willingly becoming slaves. Often overlooked today, slavery was always an institutionalized part of Slavic life. However, in this time of crisis, the sheer number of people in servitude would reach heights previously unseen. A surprisingly high number of nobles also took the desperate path of servitude. Their goal was to avoid both paying taxes and the burden of ruling a depopulated land. Enslaved nobles became elite militiamen for wealthy magnates, ironically often better equipped than their masters. Even if this practice was forbidden for nobles, about a fourth of the Tsar's army was composed of voluntarily enslaved noblemen. This widespread phenomenon contributed to weakening even more the army and, by consequence, the very stability of the state. Because of all of these disasters, both the Russian economy and society collapsed. This forced Ivan IV to seek an end to the Livonian War. A humiliating agreement was found in 1583 as Russia failed to gain an outlet to the Baltic Sea. All of these catastrophes and setbacks took an enormous toll on the Tsar's health. He was psychologically drained by grief and paranoia, and physically destroyed by a life of excess, worsened by mercury treatment. In 1584, the first Russian autocrat rendered his last breath. His successor was his last surviving and mentally disabled son, Fyodor. Ivan's successor would usher in a barely believable and far more dangerous period for Russia, jeopardizing its very existence. As we saw, the heritage of Ivan IV is contrasted. The Tsar can be credited with efforts of modernization, increasing Russia's size, and strengthening the power of the Tsar. Nonetheless, Ivan IV left behind him a depleted country, deeply divided politically, with weakened institutions, and at the mercy of more powerful neighbors. All of these negative factors were amplified by elements out of his control, such as plagues, bad harvests, or harsh weather. Being caused by the Tsar or not, these elements cause lasting and critical instabilities. Ultimately, the country would be pushed to the brink of extinction during a period evocatively remembered as the Time of Troubles. Thank you for watching this episode on Russia's history. More untold pages of history are on the way, so if you do not want to miss any, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. These, as you know, help tremendously. This is Forgotten Fragment. Until next time for the next story.